Hello and welcome. I'm Cyrus Bales and this is coverage of Axion Now's Wednesday Night Legacy, May edition. On the first Wednesday of every month, Axion Now runs a sanctioned Legacy tournament at regular REL. We decided to showcase this format by recording coverage of the final round of each of these events, putting the deck with the best record on camera to show people what this format is all about and hopefully encourage some of you to join us next time. So, let's get underway. Of course, as is typical when you do something like this, it ended up with myself being on camera for this one because I was 3-0 in the round. I'm on the left and I'm playing against Luke Winston on the right. For this event I was on Dredge. It's a slightly different build to normal, but we'll discuss it as it comes up. And Luke is on what can only be described as a really interesting rug brew. We're currently resolving mulligans. Obviously the Dredge deck is quite good at mulliganing. It can go quite low on cards and still manage to hit its engine that it's trying to run with. Luke knows what I'm playing at this point, so he's basically trying to find some sort of counter spell or interaction because he's seen me playing in other tables and wants to be able to stop sort of any turn 1 degeneracy. Apologies for the low-tech outlook so far. This is the first time we're recording coverage, but we just really wanted to get some Legacy coverage out there because we know how much you guys love it, and hopefully we can bring you to our events. So we've got the second mulligan coming on now. So let's see what the second lots of hands are. Are these keepers for us? Yes. So Dredge player on the left, myself, is keeping it. I'm taking a scry and leaving it on top. So basically what the Dredge deck wants to do here is really go off quickly and hard in these sorts of matchups. Generally, game 1, Dredge is going to win. So this is going to be quite a good turn if I recall rightly. So we have a Mana Confluence, a Lion's Eye Diamond, a second Lion's Eye Diamond. So casting a spell off of the Mana Confluence to take 1 damage. That's a Careful Study. In response to the Careful Study, I'm cycling a Street Wraith, and in response to that, I'm cracking the Lion's Eye Diamond for red mana to then put my hand into the graveyard. What this then does is allow the draws of all of these spells to draw my dredges. So we draw 2 cards, so we replace the first draw, sorry, we draw 1 card off of the Street Wraith, and we replace that draw with Dredging for a Golgari Thug, and then we have the Careful Study to resolve. So we're dredging a Stinkweed Imp for 5, and then another Stinkweed Imp for another 5. And we got some triggers of things in the graveyard. Oh, sorry, this wasn't a Careful Study. This was a Breakthrough. This was an even better turn than I seem to recall. So we're dredging a Golgari Thug. And then we had to draw a regular card because we didn't have any more dredges. So now the Breakthrough's finished resolving, certain things from the graveyard happen. So we have Narcomoeba triggers, and we also have some Creeping Chills, which are more common in the modern version, but I was trying out a list with them in the Legacy version, which allows you to push a little bit of extra damage where sometimes you'd be held up on board by a lot of control elements of some of the controlling decks. So using the red mana from the Lion's Eye Diamond that we cracked earlier, I'm using a Faithless Looting. So what this Faithless Looting is doing is letting me draw some more cards to keep it going again. So we've done some more dredging of the things that we discarded earlier. And then another Narcomoeba trigger and another Creeping Chill trigger. So we've had 3 Creeping Chill triggers so far. So we've already hit them for 9 before we've even got into an attack step. And because we had another Lion's Eye Diamond, we're then cracking for another Faithless Looting. This time we have Golgari Grave Troll, so we're dredging even deeper. So, as you can see, this is pretty much the best turn 1 you can get with a Dredge deck. So the aim of the game is to basically put as much of your graveyard into your library, into your graveyard as possible. This is an annoying moment where we found there was a sideboard card in my deck that shouldn't be there. Because we play at regular REL, the correct fix for this, as my opponent in this, Luke, he was the judge of the event. So the correct fix for this is to remove it and de-sideboard and then shuffle the library together. What happened was this was just 1 additional card. So there was no need to shuffle anything else into the deck. It was just remove it and then shuffle. Obviously, at this stage, Luke knows that the writing is on the wall because this is pretty much a phenomenal turn 1 that you're not going to be able to best, especially since he didn't have any interaction in what is clearly a blue deck. So I'm going to finish off doing the dredging. There's a few more cards to flip over. So we currently have 3 Narcomoebas in play. So the way the dredge deck works is once you have all these things in the graveyard, certain things jump out. So the Narcomoebas jump out as soon as they hit the graveyard. And there's also Icarids which jump out at the beginning of turn. Once your creatures have jumped out, you have a thing called Bridge from Below in your graveyard, which means that whenever a creature you control dies, you get a token that's a 2/2 zombie. Now, because I have several of them in my graveyard, 4 at this point, it means that every time I sacrifice a Narcomoeba, I get 4 zombies. And to make me have something to sacrifice them to, I have Cabal Therapies in my graveyard. So at this point, I get to see Luke's hand. He's running a strange sort of rug brew with a lot of cool grindy tools. So it's Life from the Loam, Jace the Mind Sculptor, Punishing Fire, Tireless Tracker. So at this point, I'm just sacrificing my Narcomoebas to remove his hand and make as much power as I can on the board. And because I can see his whole hand, I can take him off of any action whatsoever. So this is currently 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 24 damage I have in play at the moment that I've managed to put on turn 1. My opponent, even though he went first, doesn't have any way to interact with this. Beginning of my upkeep, there's a thing called Icarid where you can exile a black creature card from your graveyard to return it to play, and it has haste and is a 3/1, but it dies at end of turn. And this can only be happening in your upkeep that you bring it back. So this is where I attack for quite a large amount of damage. So I think it's 30 exactly. So that was game 1. Considering we were trying to showcase the format of Legacy, which a lot of people have a false conception of being turn 1 wombo combo, this was potentially not the best deck to choose, but we wanted to put the best record on. Of course, it's a best of 3, so there's still more to come. Dredge normally wins game 1, but struggles a bit in game 2 and 3, depending on the sideboard of your opponent. So this is where we're looking at sideboarding. So from the Dredge point of view, a lot of people who pick up Dredge think it's an easy deck to start with, but games 2 and 3 are where it really matters, because you have to not only know what you're doing, but know what your opponent's doing and the best way around that for your deck. Obviously, without the graveyard, you can't win a game as Dredge, so you need to be able to identify what anti-graveyard tools are coming in and how to best them. So for this particular game, I chose to bring in some general catch-alls. So I had Nature's Claim, which is green, destroy target, artifact or enchantment, its control against 4 life. The 4 life is largely irrelevant in this because as long as your engine's whirling, you keep going, and they tend to only have 1 or 2 things to stop you. So because my opponent was playing Rug, I didn't expect to see Leyline of the Void, so I didn't board in specific anti-Leyline cards. But generally in game 2, you bring in catch-alls if you're the Dredge player. You want to have something that's going to be able to deal with any sort of threat, whether it's an artifact hate piece, or an enchantment hate piece, or even a creature hate piece, something like Scavenging Ooze or something like that. So you tend to want to bring in any catch-alls that you have, which may be things like Chain of Vapor, or in this case I was running Echoing Truth, which can hit multiple of the same thing. So for this I was bringing in Echoing Truth as well as a mixture between Nature's Claims and Wear Tear. Obviously, because most of the mana that you have is Rainbow Lands, aside from the Cephalic Colosseums, you can generally cast any sort of sideboard cards. Now, what you have to do as a Dredge player is just shave a little bit here and there. So you maybe take out one of your Dredges potentially, which would be a Golgari Thug as it's the weakest, and then you take out some of your discard outlets. So things like Breakthrough are obviously a lot less useful in game 2. Whilst they can give you a really powerful start like we saw in game 1, it doesn't give you as much ability to play around things. So if you have just draw and discard spells like Faithless Looting and Careful Study, it means that you can keep your sideboard cards in hand. So if they do wipe your graveyard or play something backbreaking like a Grafdigger's Cage or something, you can then deal with it because you haven't discarded your whole hand. Obviously, quite often when you do a big draw for discard your hand, you end up getting a lot of power on the board, so it doesn't necessarily matter, but it's just a better card to shave usually than some of the other ones. So from Luke's point of view here, what he wants to do is bring in any of his spells that are actually useful. So things like Punishing Fire aren't the best in his deck, and some of his slower cards aren't the best in his deck. So he wants to be reducing his curve. Punishing Fire is useful on his own creatures more so than mine, because Punishing Fire allows you to remove Bridge from Below from your opponent's graveyard. And without Bridge from Below, the Dredge player can't manufacture a lot of zombies. So because he's a Rug player, he doesn't have access to all of the really good white enchantments like Rest in Peace. So he's more likely going to be on Artifact Hate. So we're expecting things like Grafdigger's Cage, Tormod's Crypt, and then Scavenging Ooze because he's in green. Sometimes you may see something like a Fairy Macabre, which can sort of be played anywhere, because whilst a Leyline is obviously good on turn 1, you still want a deck that can necessarily play it or avoid drawing it later on. So you tend to see in decks with Urborg or black mana in general, you see Leylines more often than in something like a Rug deck like this. So as a Dredge player, I'm mulliganing quite low again because I have to find the right bits. So you're ideally looking for, in game 2, you're looking for something to protect yourself. So one of your sideboard cards as well as a Dredger and a Discarder. You tend to play a slower game out of the board because you're playing around things. So Luke's led off on a Scalding Tarn. Myself on the left has left off with a City of Brass into a Silent Greystone because I was expecting Surgical Extraction, which is a powerful tool that a lot of these sort of blue grindy decks use. So I expected Luke's deck to be running Snapcaster, which makes Surgical Extraction a good shout. It also hoses on things like Scavenging Ooze, so it's quite a good catch-all for several different things. So what Luke's done here is he's wastelanded the first land that was played, which is the City of Brass, to allow the sideboard card in, and then he's managed to Force of Will my Lion's Eye Diamond, which was a discard outlet that I was going to use to start the engine going, as well as adding red mana. I led off on the anti-sideboard hate card, because you want to protect yourself before you start going off, because I knew that Luke's deck wasn't a fast combo deck. So this is where I get to resolve a Careful Study. So discarded 2 Dredges by the looks of it. I think it's Stinkweed Imp and Golgari Thug. So Luke's playing pretty much a draw-go game at this stage. So he's got a couple of fetch lands in play ready to go, or 3 fetch lands I think at the moment. He's just waiting. What he wants to do is make this game go as long as possible so he can get his game plan on the run with all his card advantage and ability to control the board, and more importantly my graveyard and the spells I'm casting. So for my turn there, I dredged. I didn't necessarily hit anything useful. No Narcomoebas have jumped out so far. This is a Cabal Therapy cast from my hand. So Luke's thinking. So because he's a blue deck, he's got a lot of options here. So he could be thinking about brainstorming to hide cards so I can't take them. But obviously you get into mind games of what do I name at that point. This time he's just going to show me what he's got. So that looks like a Life from the Loam, a Force of Will, and another blue card, which I think was a counter spell. So it's quite a tricky hand to get through. The Life from the Loam being shut off by the Silent Greystone is also quite useful for my piece of sideboard tech. So back to my turn, the Dredge player. We're dredging 4 with a Golgari Thug, sorry. This time we've hit a Narcomoeba, which jumps out the graveyard. So at this point it should be clear as well. Earlier in the tournament I saw what Luke was playing to a degree. I knew that he had the Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo in his deck and some green tools to find it, things like Crop Rotation, which makes it quite difficult to decide what to do, because sometimes when you have a 1/1 fire and your opponent can make a 20/20 out of nowhere, you want to be a little bit careful. Obviously I couldn't attack this turn with my Narcomoeba because it has Summoning Sickness. But I was deciding whether or not I should Cabal Therapy to try and hit something. But obviously I knew what was in his hand, so I was waiting to Cabal Therapy to hit something specific. So this is where Luke has deployed a Snapcaster Mage. He hasn't deployed it to cast a spell. He's done it because it lets him get a clock in, as well as giving himself something to remove potentially in the case of Bridge from Below's on my side of the board. That way he can mute my ability to make lots and lots of zombies. So at this point I'm drawing regular cards rather than dredging, which is the last thing a dredge deck wants to do. So at this point, excuse me, I'm trying to find some sort of way of putting these dredges that are in my hand into the graveyard. And then we're just attacking for one. So I decided to attack for one that turn because there was no Thespian Stage or Dark Depths. Now Lucas deployed a Thespian Stage, which means it's going to become tricky for me to do anything with this Narcomoeba, because I may need to block against a 2020. Again, this shows you that even reliable 60-card combo decks like Dredge still have a fail rate where you end up drawing cards instead of dredging because you didn't hit any dredges with your previous two dredges. Luke's coming in again with a Snapcaster Mage. So this race is very much in his favour. But at some point, myself, the Dredge player, is going to be able to discard some of my cards to hand size, which is going to allow me to start the dredging chain again. It's just a case of whether or not I can do that before Luke deploys some sort of 2020 monster. Of course, at this stage, he has access potentially to a crop rotation, which could mean I could be in a lot of trouble. So this is why there was no attack from the Narcomoeba. I'm already losing the race anyway, and I can potentially offer a trade. But I choose not to make the trade because I'm keeping it back on blocks in case I need to block a 2020. So at this point, Luke has a grip full of cards. He can hard cast a Force of Will. So now we get to dredge because I discarded at the end of last turn. It feels a little bit too late on this side of the table. So we know Luke has two pieces of disruption in terms of the Force of Will and the counterspell. He can't hardcast them both, but chances are by now he's gotten a counterspell. Oh, and there we go. So Luke has drawn the Dark Depths, so he now has the combo on board. So now I obviously have no choice but to let the 2 damage from the Snapcaster through because I at least need to buy one turn by blocking the 2020 with my Narcomoeba. Back to the Dredge player's turn, which is me. We exile a card. Usually the first thing you exile in the build I'm running is the Street Wraith because it has no value in the graveyard, but sometimes you have to exile some of your dredges. So this brings back the Icarid, try and get as much power as possible this turn, and then do a nice deep dredging of 5. So I have a Lion's Eye Diamond that I was sandbagging to try and use for an explosive turn when as soon as Faithless Looting entered my graveyard. Of course, Luke has a lot of disruption, and I've known he's had a lot of disruption, so I haven't been trying to run out this Lion's Eye Diamond. Luke basically has all of the options to do whatever he likes with here. He can basically let me dredge as much as he likes because he knows that a dredge plan isn't going to be able to interact very well with a 2020 that has no cards in hand. So there we see the counter spell that Luke has. He's pitched it to a Force of Will, so he still has the mana to activate his Thespian Stage targeting Dark Depths. What this combo does is the Thespian Stage becomes a Dark Depths but with no counters on it, as that enters the battlefield ability. So it comes in with no counters on and automatically sees itself as an empty Dark Depths and becomes a 2020. So you have to legend rule out your first Dark Depths. But it's a very cheap and effective way of making a 2020, which as win conditions go is not a bad one. So here we see a Punishing Fire, which is another part of Luke's deck. It's sort of a high value train deck. Before this round, I believe Luke was 2-1. So now he's making a 2020 at end of my turn, so it can attack on his turn. And he's used the Punishing Fires to remove the only blocker, which was my Narcomoeba, which is why I have zombies in play. So now he gets to turn sideways with a 2020. Of course, we didn't actually have a token here, so it's a deck divider, I believe. So that's 20 damage to the face, and that's game over. So, as you can see, it's not just a case of the combo deck trying to do its thing. It was a case of Luke interacting with it in several ways. So, whilst I got to shut off his Life from the Loam using my Silent Gravestone, he had the ability to counter some crucial spells. So we had some Lion's Eye Diamonds we had a Lion's Eye Diamond hit earlier, I believe, and then we had another one there. So it's kind of, a blue deck does have the ability to interact with a dredge deck quite well because you have the free counterspell, so you can react on turn 1 before you've even laid any lands. So now we're going into game 3. So for game 3, what you'll quite often find from a dredge player is that they'll, especially if they know some of the hate they've seen, they're going to be maybe streamline their deck to be a little bit faster, but with 1 or 2 ways, depending on what sideboard cards they're worried about, but they'll try and be a bit faster than they were game 2. So game 2, they're basically trying to definitely play through the hate. Game 3, they're trying to go fast on turn 1 or 2, whilst having some cards in against the hate. So I believe what I was doing with this time is I boarded out one of the Nature's Claims I boarded in. So I still had a Claim, a Wear Tear, and an Echoing Truth, which is obviously very good against a 2020 as well. I think I also took out one of the Silent Gravestones, whilst it was good against the Life from the Loam, which he did show me at the end of the game. It seemed like he wasn't really a surgical extraction deck as much, so I could take those out, but leave one in case he was, as well as the fact that he might be playing Life from the Loam game 3, so at least slow him down as well if it becomes a grindy sort of game, which isn't really what you want to play with Dredge, but you have the ability to keep fielding guys every turn, generally, when you're sort of dredging and you hit your Narc amoebas or whatever. Also, this version of Dredge I'm playing has the Creeping Chills, which is a really good card to shave when you're sideboarding. You can sort of go down to 2 or 3 copies. But what it allows you to do is push a little bit of extra damage through without having to worry about the board. So if your opponent's got has got some sort of punishing fire combo like Luke has, it means that where he can snipe down your Icarod while also killing his own guys to remove your bridges, it lets you kind of slowly push for a little bit more damage, so you don't have to try and do all 20 points of damage with creatures. You can sort of try and hedge through and get 6 to 9 damage through that way. It also gives you a little bit of a buffer, so if you gain enough life to put yourself over 20, you can take a hit from a 2020, which is why I didn't board out all of my Creeping Chills. So again, we're mulliganing. At this point, Luke's looking for turn 1 interaction because he's on the draw this time. He needs to have something on turn 1 to try and stop it, or at least something that he can play on his turn 1 after I have a good turn 1. Obviously, if he's looking for a small piece of hate, whether it's a Tormod's Crypt or something like that, having it on his turn 1 after I've had my turn 1 generally will be alright, because the Dredge deck doesn't always have these broken turns like you saw in game 1 here. So now we've mulliganed down quite low. I think I'm down to, is that 4 cards, me on the left, and I think Luke is down to 5. Oh no, I think it's 5 apiece actually. So I think what's happened, if I remember rightly when I had this hand, so I had a hand where I had the top card of my library was a Faithless Looting. So the setup here is that I play the Cephalid Colosseum this turn and then the Faithless Looting next turn, and I can get the maximum amount of dredges in. So Luke has played Grafdigger's Cage on his first turn, whilst I didn't do anything with my first turn. So Grafdigger's Cage basically means that none of my creatures come out of the graveyard. So Icarod and Narcomoeba are both unable to come out of the graveyard, which is the main engine that gets the deck rolling. And you can't cast Cabal Therapies. So this puts the Dredge player myself in a really bad position. So what I have to do there is use my draw discard effects, like my Careful Studies and Faithless Lootings, like you see here. Not to discard things into my graveyard and dredge hard, but to dig into my deck to try and find the answer to the Grafdigger's Cage. So at this point, Luke gets a lot more breathing room. So he's just sort of, as long as this Grafdigger's Cage is in play, he's safe. So what he's trying to do now is make sure that his hand has ways to protect the Grafdigger's Cage, which is the problem when you have a hate piece like this in a blue deck for a dredge player. Not only do you have to remove it, but you have to get around the potential counterspells they may have. So what you tend to do as a dredge player in this situation is you keep trying to draw and discard as best you can until you can find the pieces, but you're also looking for a Cabal Therapy. Here on Luke's side, we see a Thespian Stage. Now we see me on the left cycling a Street Wraith, again, just trying to get deeper and deeper into my library to find the pieces. So here we have the very bad backup plan of casting your really poor dredge creatures. So a 2-mana 1/1 in Golgari Thug is not really where you want to be. Unfortunately, you have to do what you have to do. You have to play with the game as it is, not as you want it to be. So Luke's just playing a draw-go game at this point, just making sure that he keeps up his ability to potentially crop rotate end of turn and make a 20/20, or play counter spells to stop me if I have disruption for his plan. So I believe I have 2 crippling chills in my hand at this point in this game as well. So this turn I'm trying to use the Cabal Therapy to see what I'm up against in terms of the disruption that he has available. I think I also have an Echoing Truth in hand. So the idea is to try and see what we're up against. So as you can see, that's a Surgical Extraction and some lands, including a Wasteland. And there's a middle card which I can't see. I don't quite remember what it was. So the Cabal Therapy hasn't hit. But it's given me the information of what I'm up against. I think the middle one might have been a counter spell, actually, of some description. So now on Luke's turn, he's just finding some land. He's got an uncracked fetch land, so if he draws some sort of brainstorm effect, he still has the ability to shuffle. It's always useful keeping... Whereas people in Modern will often say, oh, crack your fetch lands to help you thin at end of turn. In Legacy, you tend to not want to crack your fetch lands because you have so many things like Ponder and Brainstorm where you want to be able to... And obviously Jace, which brainstorms as well. You want to be able to shuffle your library after you've used one of those effects. So cracking your fetch lands, the cost of thinning a very, very minimal amount is not worth it when you have the ability to shuffle your library after taking 1 card from a Ponder or shuffling away a Brainstorm. Here Luke's deployed a Tarmogoyf, which is a pretty good threat against a deck that is trying to put its library into its graveyard. And it certainly makes my 1/1 Golgari Thug look a bit weedy. So on the left here we've got a couple of Lion's Eye Diamonds. So we have the ability to dredge really hard once we can remove the piece, which is what the plan is. At this point I was trying to sculpt my hand in a way to remove the cage and then crack the Lion's Eye Diamonds to do a really big dredging turn. I don't think I actually had the Echoing Truth yet. Oh, there we go. We can see the Echoing Truth there. This is the turn I drew the Echoing Truth. So we have the mana to cast it as well. Of course, trying to cast it into a blue player with all this mana up is always a bit scary, as well as making sure that I have something to do once I do cast it. The Wasteland is going to be annoying because it's going to shut me off a turn. But he's gone for the Jace instead, just so he can pull ahead in card advantage and get the counter spells to protect his Grafdigger's Cage. At this point, his game plan is entirely protect the Grafdigger's Cage, but he just so happened to get a Tarmogoyf, which massively increases his clock. So he not only is he protecting the cage till his later game where he gets to use all the card advantage like Jace, he's protecting. He's got this Tarmogoyf to then sort of rail into my face a few times and end the game quite quickly. As you can see, I'm down to 14 life at this point. And I've drawn a 3rd land, which is really good for the Dredge player at this point because you can then turn on your Faithless Lootings in your graveyard. Not that you can cast them, but it means that if you bounce his thing end of turn, you can then untap and Faithless Looting, as well as you can Faithless Looting with your mana as well as with your Lion's Eye Diamonds, so you could potentially get 6 dredge, 6 draws that you can replace with dredging. Of course, the other upside is that you get to cast Stinkweed Imp, which is it's a good blocker because it has pseudo Death Touch. Obviously, in the face of a Jace the Mind Sculptor who can bounce it, it's less good. But at least you're making him go down rather than finding more stuff or altering the top of your deck to try and get you away from being able to Cabal Therapy, which is the plan at this point, is to Cabal Therapy to make sure that the Echoing Truth can stick. So there's still a few turns left for our Dredge player, who is me, to try and pull this one out. It's looking quite favourable for Luke on the right here, though. So there we go. He has the Thespian Stage and the Dark Depths in play now, both drawn naturally this time, which is the same as last game, but his deck draws a fair amount of cards, and that's why they're in there, to draw them. And he's played this game really well. He's controlled everything I'm doing. He mulled to a really useful card in the Grafdigger's Cage, and it's done well to make sure it's protected. So at this point it changes what I have to do with the Echoing Truth. The Echoing Truth now becomes this buys me a turn by getting rid of the Dark Depths. So what I have to do is wait to see what happens. So obviously he's got a Lightning Bolt, which is then going to blow up the blocker for his Dark Depths. So I need to keep hold of the Echoing Truth to bounce the Marit Lage token once it comes out. As well as at this end of turn, Luke's making the 2020. If Tarmogoyf wasn't big enough, for 2020 certainly is. So this is where I try to bounce his guy, but he has the counter spell in hand, which I think was the card he had when I Cabal Therapied him all those turns ago, which is why I didn't pull the trigger on it earlier. So, and that is the end of that game. So Luke manages to win the game 2-1. After losing the first game, he rallied quite nicely in the sideboard. Game 3 especially with his Grafdigger's Cage and the protection he had for it. Game 2 was a bit closer. Obviously myself and the Dredge didn't quite fire as nicely as you want to, because you sometimes you're going to draw your Dredges and not hit anymore. Anyone who's played Dredge in Modern or in Legacy knows that that's the case sometimes. But yeah, so that's just a little taster of some of the games we get playing in Axion Now. On the first Wednesday of every month, there's going to be Legacy. So why not come down? There's also Legacy for Goodies that takes place usually once a month. The date varies. But if you like Legacy, you definitely need to come down and check out Axion Now. It's one of the best places in the country, in my opinion, to play Legacy. So I hope you've enjoyed the coverage and it's inspired you to play a bit more Legacy and come and join us. I've been Cyrus Bales. Thank you for listening to me cover this game, and take care and hopefully see you at Axion Now at some point. Goodbye.